The searchlight beams cut the black water into trembling panes, then vanished as gunners fired again. Shells stitched the night above Iron Bottom Sound. In the cramped steel heart of the light cruiser USS Juneau, men braced at stations and counted the seconds between muzzle flashes and thunder. Guadalcanal turned training into attrition. The sea smelled of hot oil and cordite. Somewhere ahead, beyond tracer arcs, an enemy destroyer closed. Juneau was an Atlanta-class light cruiser, built to punch and to protect. Her decks bristled with 5-inch mounts and anti-aircraft batteries. Her crew, nearly 700, moved like a single machine through the chaos. Among them were 5 brothers from Waterloo, Iowa: George, Francis, Joseph, Madison, and Albert Sullivan. They had enlisted together and insisted on serving together. On Juneau, they ate in the same mess, kept shared watches, and wrote the same jokes home. Night of November 12, 1942, the air war found them first. Japanese planes dove on transports and airstrips. Juneau's guns vomited fire until flaming wreckage hit the water. The ship kept up a brutal rhythm. Later, a close action with Japanese surface forces turned the darkness into a melee. Searchlights bloomed, tracer stitched through smoke, and metal screamed as steel found steel. Juneau's guns hammered at targets that appeared and vanished. Then, a destroyer's torpedo knifed into her port side near the bridge, breaking her insides and lashing the ship with a blow that stunned men where they stood. She shuddered, lost speed, and dropped out of line, the engineers fighting to keep enough power to move. She could still shoot, she could still breathe, but she was wounded, leaking, limping, and vulnerable in a sea thick with unseen knives. Dawn drew a poor curtain over the carnage. Wreckage drifted. Some ships burned, others listed or crawled away. Juneau turned south in company with battered sisters, San Francisco and Helena among them, forming a crippled procession headed for Espiritu Santo. Even damaged, Juneau felt alive. Pumps ran, wounded were bandaged, the galley sent hot coffee forward, the brothers moved among their shipmates, checking on friends and on one another. The crew held to the belief that daylight and distance meant safety. But submarines hunt by patience. The Japanese boat by 26 watched the column and waited for angles to sharpen. Shortly after 11 a.m., a white wake streaked toward the cluster of wounded ships. Lookouts shouted. Men turned their heads and then turned them again because the ocean seemed to leap upward. The torpedo struck Juneau near the same fracture wrought in the night fight. What the destroyer's blow began, the submarine's shot completed. A pillar of dirty fire punched into the sky. The light cruiser broke as if snapped by a giant hand. Her bow and stern lifted, halves rotating, then the sea erased the distance between them. To some survivors, it felt as if the ship simply disappeared between one heartbeat and the next. 20 seconds, that was all. The ocean boiled with debris, oil, and men. Shock had no time to harden into meaning. The escorting ships, aware of the submarine, did not stop. There were hard calculations in narrow seas. If they lingered, another torpedo might rip out the rescuers. If they pressed on, the men in the water would have to hold on to anything that floated and wait for rescue that might not come. They pressed on. The survivors, perhaps 100 and more in those first minutes, clung to planks, cork floats, and splintered rafts in a field of oil that slicked their mouths and burned their eyes. They called names, they counted, they waited. Sun burned the oil film into skin. Rain squalls passed and left thirst crueler. Night brought cold and the language of splashes. Sharks came because sharks always come when steel and blood meet warm water. The men beat the water with broken boards and tried not to look at what circled. They talked in fragments about home, about the mess deck, about the last thing they saw before the deck heaved. They argued not to drift apart. Hours became a calendar in the mind. A plane flew over and did not see them. Another day came, and fewer voices answered. Among those who lived long enough to tell it later was boatswain's mate Harold Gus Gallagher. He remembered the heat, the absence of ships on the horizon, and the slow counting backward of companions. 8 days would pass before a PBY flying boat spotted a scattering of men on a raft and in the open water. Only 10 survivors were ultimately pulled from the Pacific. Out of roughly 697 aboard Juneau, 687 were lost. Among the dead were the 5 brothers from Waterloo. They were sons of a single house, small-town boys whose faces were in church programs and on neighborhood porches. Their mother received a telegram that changed everything and turned a household into a map of absence. In Waterloo, photographs covered a mantel, flags fluttered half-mast, and neighbors gathered in silence to name what had happened. The Sullivans' faces circulated in the papers. They became instantly both a family's grief and a national emblem. The Navy's after-action work read like a ledger of angles and risks, torpedo tracks, sighting bearings, escort dispositions. Behind the technical terms, commanders argued the impossible choice that follows a sinking, whether to stop and attempt rescue in a submarine-infested field, or to press on and hope more ships do not pay the cost. The escorts pressed on. That decision left men to drift in oil and rain, and later conversations would ask whether anything done differently might have changed the outcome. Survivors told fragments that did not always fit into reports. One remembered the sound as a twisting metallic cry. Another spoke of a hand gripping his for a minute longer than felt necessary, a promise made without words. Small acts, passing a tin of biscuit, sharing a smoke, steadying a flimsy float, turned into the language of endurance. Days in the water were measured in thirst and the slow erosion of hope. Planes passed overhead without seeing them. Sharks came. A PBY flying boat eventually found a scattering of men and the ruined furniture of a ship now invisible. The Sullivans' deaths prompted a change in how the military treats family members. Policy shifted to prevent putting siblings in the same combat unit whenever possible, a bureaucratic attempt to prevent a single family from being hollowed at once. The policy could not stop the grief, only try to limit the chance of a repeat. Memorials were raised, a destroyer named USS the Sullivans, plaques and statues in town squares. People left wreaths and letters. In small museums, dog tags and photos sit beside letters and folded uniforms. Years later, explorers found Juneau's broken hull and sent back images of twisted steel and silt. The photographs offered a place for the story to settle, a coordinate to match memory. They did not restore the men, but they anchored the tale to a place in the deep. For survivors and families, that discovery was difficult and necessary, proof that the losses had a resting place, a point on a map where a ship's complement had gone still. The long view of Juneau's story is messy and human. War can be reduced to strategy and tonnage, but the real accounting happens in kitchens and in empty chairs at tables where 5 plates were once set. The Juneau carried hundreds of stories, letters folded into pockets, photographs in wallets, jokes shouted over gunfire, and when she went down, all those ordinary things fell silent. That is why we remember, not for the blast of steel or the statistics, but for the people who ate from those plates and the faces that waited for them. Stand at a quiet pier and listen for the slow draw of a wake. Imagine a cruiser the size of a city block holding 700 heartbeats, men doing ordinary work inside extraordinary noise. Then hold still and listen for the small sounds survivors carried, the slap of hands on water, a voice calling a brother's name. That is how Juneau moves now, in memory, policy, and the empty places left behind. Thank you for listening to the Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.